Good morning and good afternoon to the Australian UAE Business Council members and our guests. My name is Ellecia Saffron and I'm an advisory board member for the Aus UAE Business Council, which was launched in 2020. Today's event is on artificial intelligence. It's our third webinar of the group, and we have three fantastic panelists that will be speaking with us today about all things AI. The first speaker will be Mr. Daniel Keys from xAmplify, and we are also joined by Mr. Talal Kaissi from G42 Cloud, and Mr. Keith Strier hopefully will be joining us from NVIDIA for today's session. First of all, though, I'd like to welcome His Excellency Mr. Badr Al-Olama, who is the co-chair of the Aus UAE Business Council, who's representing him and Mr. Christopher Pine today to welcome participants and guests.
Thank you, Ellie, and good morning, everyone. Welcome to this webinar. I'm very pleased that you found some time to join us. It's obviously a very important topic. Everyone around the world is talking about the importance of technology and the importance of artificial intelligence. In the UAE itself, we have a minister for AI demonstrating the importance that the UAE is placing on the artificial intelligence sector. In essence, this webinar is the result of us at the Australia UAE Business Council deciding on forming a working group, an artificial intelligence technologies working group that will work over the next 12 months to explore opportunities between the members and hopefully present these opportunities and any challenges associated in terms of progressing business, government, policy type of partnership and collaboration between Australia and the United Arab Emirates. I'd like to say that both Australia and the UAE share the same vision and belief in the pivotal role of technology. We believe that AI, or artificial intelligence, is at the heart of these transformative technologies. And if deployed wisely, it could reap a lot of social, business, and governance benefits to our nations. I hope you enjoy these discussions, and I'd like to welcome our panelists, both Daniel and Talal. Talal, for those of you that are going to be hearing, I'm quite excited because I've known Talal for quite some time. He is extremely passionate about technology, but more so, and more importantly so, he represents one of the most important companies in the UAE that is actually championing technology, which is Group 42 or G42. Over to you, Ellie. Thank you for giving this opportunity to actually share the welcome and also share some information about G42 to our members.
Thank you, Your Excellency. And so I'd like to introduce first Mr. Daniel Keys, who's the Head of Futures and Innovation at xAmplify. He has over 25 years experience in ICT delivery and has held senior digital and ICT leadership roles at the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, Digital Transformation Agency, and the Australian Tax Office. Before joining the Australian government, Daniel held leadership roles in a number of private sector companies and established a small ICT consulting specializing in ICT strategy and architecture. However, today he's known as an inspirational leader of large digital transformation programs, and he's most recently served as Chief Information Officer at the Commonwealth Department of Health, leading the delivery of many solutions in response to the recent COVID-19 pandemic. Hi, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Ellie, for the introduction, and thanks to all the panelists for and all the webinar guests for joining us. Look, we're really excited here at xAmplify to be part of the Australian UAE Business Council, and we just, like to offer an Australian perspective of what we're seeing with regards to artificial intelligence. I thought I'd touch on a few different aspects of what we see here in Australia. The first one being, I guess, sort of awareness of artificial intelligence and its maturity within various different sectors. We see some sectors, such as our mining sector, embracing and really driving change using artificial intelligence. But in the whole, in Australia, we see a lag of sort of adoption of sort of modern artificial intelligence capabilities within solutions. And I think at the core of that is that people really don't understand the sort of practical implications of AI in business and how to transform their business. It sounds complicated, it sounds dangerous, and people don't understand where the boundaries are and really struggle to see the real value. I think there's a lack in Australia of real resounding success stories. And we've also really got a lack of really tangible return on investment metrics that can be used to justify an investment, a significant investment in artificial intelligence. So I think that in the whole, there's really quite a lack of awareness, and there's a lot of work that we need to do within Australia to educate not just the technical people, but senior leaders, business leaders, and also the community on the use and the ethical and safe use of artificial intelligence and the way that it can change the way we live our lives. What we are seeing, xAmplify Australia's lead artificial intelligence integrator, and what we are seeing is that there's an emerging demand around 4 key themes of artificial intelligence in Australia. The first one is around object detection. So real-time object recognition, leveraging some innovative technologies we have in Australia that are providing a plug and play type platform that allows you to pick up different recognition technologies and use them for real-time alerting and monitoring of primarily law enforcement and national security use cases. That's quite an easy use case for people to understand because there's an instant way to I guess validate that return on investment and the value proposition that's associated with something that's done quite a traditional and manual process into an automated artificial intelligence engine. So it's quite a tangible thing, so people are embracing that. The second sort of area is really around natural language processing, and it's primarily being used at the moment in service delivery and in integrated knowledge management. And really, I think the use case that's being embraced the most within Australia is multi-language speech to text, and some of that automated document discovery, sentiment analysis, and those types of natural language processes. We've seen a push also in Australia around the delivery of digital twins. So using digital representations of physical systems to try and drive new insights and intelligent operations. And there's quite an innovative company in Australia called Green Gravity who are doing they're basically an innovative Australian company who's using disused mine shafts to drop weights and transfer energy to and from the grid, who are using a digital twin to start to optimize and interface to the energy grid. So there's quite, I guess, a push to automate and optimize at a global level using digital twins is another area that we see of demand in artificial intelligence. And probably finally is the scientific computing. So in academia and medical research, it's scientific compute using the core artificial intelligence enabling capabilities. At xAmplify, we sort of span the full breadth of the AI stack, from strategy, training, consultancy, right through down into the enabling capabilities and the data. And we have a strong partnership with NVIDIA. I'm sure Keith will talk about this, leveraging the amazing capabilities of the technology that NVIDIA provide. And finally, I think the last thing I wanted to touch on is some of the barriers. And I'm sure this will be a topic that'll be touched on across the board in today's webinar. Is we do see probably awareness and education as one of the biggest barriers to adoption of AI in Australia. But we've also got many of the other issues such as ethical use of AI, explainability, security, privacy, etc. But fundamentally, I think the biggest barrier that we need to overcome is sort of an acceptance both from business leaders, the tech community, but also the broader Australian community around the use of AI and how that can be done to benefit the community. So thank you very much for the opportunity to come and speak with you all today. I really appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Talal and Keith's perspectives, obviously from other parts of the world. Thanks, Ellie.
Thank you, Daniel. That was an interesting intro, and I look forward to fleshing out some of the points you made during the webinar. Next, I'd like to introduce Mr. Talal Al-Kaissi. He's the CEO of G42 Cloud. Talal joined G42 in 2020 after 2 years at the UAE Space Agency, where he served as a senior advisor to the Director General. Prior to this role, Talal served at the UAE Embassy in Washington, DC for 9 years as a senior advisor for commercial affairs at the UAE Trade and Commercial Office, and led the US UAE Space Affairs collaboration. Prior to that, he's worked in the energy sector at KBR, where he led business development efforts for the GCC region in the downstream petrochemical segment, and was based between Houston, Dubai and Khobar in Saudi Arabia. Talal serves on boards at high-level international bodies, including the World Economic Forum's Space Technology Council, a board of New Space Capital, and the board of Saya Corp Capital, the board of World Space Week, and also Takalam Online Counseling. Currently in his role at G42 Cloud, he's been appointed to bring about the next phase of the company's evolution, maximizing internal potential while innovating and creating customer value in new and adjacent areas. Welcome to the webinar, Talal, and we're pleased to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellie, and thank you, Your Excellency Badr. It's good to see you again. Daniel, Keith, fellow panelists, it's really a pleasure. In fact, I've known Keith for a while, and Daniel, I think we've got a lot in common in both how our companies operate and in the partnerships we have, including that with NVIDIA. NVIDIA actually powers the supercomputer we have. We were speaking before the call of how fond I am of the Australia UAE relations. In fact, in my previous role that Ellie mentioned with respect to the space industry, I had the pleasure and privilege of being part of the agreement that we signed between both countries, and was able to visit Adelaide on a couple of occasions, and worked closely with our ambassador to Australia, His Excellency Abdullah Al-Sabusi. And I just saw Majid sent a note over here, so it's good to see familiar people amongst us. So let me maybe take a step back and explain a few things about G42, just for the unfamiliar. We're an AI and cloud computing company at our core, and we were established in 2018 formally as G42, but prior to that, there was a big data analytics business intelligence company that was started over here by our group CEO, who had come over from the US, where he worked in the business intelligence domain, and was lured to the UAE's the government's open lab environment per se, in allowing and enabling innovation in this domain to flourish by having one thing that I think was hard to come by in multiple other areas. When you're trying to move the needle on AI, and as Badr mentioned, we have a minister of AI, and our government embraces technology in a way that I think we're able to move quicker because of the population dynamics and the need for technology to help us digitally transform. I think one thing that our group CEO Peng saw here that he didn't see when he was working for the likes of Facebook and other big clients in the US that had the volume, or companies that are involved in AI that have a need speed and velocity, was the variety element. And the variety element over here, that third V, which is critical, I think, for AI, was what really kind of showed him the opportunity at hand here in the UAE. So started up as a business intelligence entity, very analogous to what you see in, with MicroStrategy or even Palantir and others, and then quickly morphed into a lot more than just that, by seeing the power of AI and how applicable it is to multiple industries. that we now operate in. And so we quickly, in 2018, when the opportunity presented itself, morphed into, first of all, an AI institute, the Inception Institute of Artificial Intelligence, which we own and operate till today, and started off more as a fundamental AI research organization with 100 or so data scientists solving the hardest problems in computer vision, NLP, and machine learning, to now more of an applied research entity. And then the spin out from that was the Mohammed bin Zayed UAE University of AI, which now continues to focus on fundamental research. But as a private company, we are a for-profit entity, so we quickly pivoted into applied research and started looking at industry verticals, and thus the birth of G42 came about. And the low-hanging fruit at that time was the energy industry, obviously something that the UAE flourishes in, and we were looking at efficiencies and optimizations in that domain that AI was applicable to. So we structured a joint venture with our national oil company, ADNOC, and we do everything there from workflow optimization using AI to computer vision based borehole analysis, looking at seismic data and looking at best places to drill, saving billions of dollars, but more so hours or actually weeks, and armies of geologists and what they would have had to go through, because we could just run that through a supercomputer, thankfully powered by NVIDIA. And so that's how kind of G42 evolved, and now we have multiple different industry verticals powered by the brain power, let's say, with the AI Institute, and then the muscle power, which is our data center infrastructure, our connectivity layer, which helps us with optimizing latency. And we own the full value chain of both those. And then our cloud compute infrastructure that orchestrates and supports delivering that AI solution to the multiple different industry verticals, oil and gas and energy being one of them. And then healthcare, where we're doing our population genomics program, also using sequencers from Illumina, ONT, BGI, and then NVIDIA for even processing, to other areas that we can also talk about. So I sit at the point of the cloud layer, where I'm actually supporting not only our group and enabling the different industry verticals we have, from analytics to healthcare to energy, but also now increasingly becoming more of a cloud services provider, analogous to the likes of AWS and others. But we're more of a national hyperscaler, and we're not growing in the geographic footprint, except for where we are deploying a similar architecture on a sovereign cloud level, which we can also talk about later in different countries around the world as well. So I'll stop there. I just wanted to give that overarching perspective as to what G42 is, the importance to the UAE's national digital transformation agenda, and where we play as an implementer and an executor of that vision, and then where I sit at the G42 cloud layer.
Thank you, Talal. That was great. And now I'd like to welcome Mr. Keith Strier, who's the Vice President of Worldwide AI Initiatives at NVIDIA. Keith leads an initiative called AI Nations, which is a worldwide program that helps government leaders and stakeholders develop plans to implement AI to advance national priorities and drive economic growth. Keith has worked with senior leaders across public and private sectors in all markets to help them understand the new art of the possible when AI, GPU accelerated computing, autonomous machines, and IoT are deployed at scale. He's a former global AI leader for EY and formerly the global CDO for Deloitte, with a 20-year record as a trusted advisor, practice leader, and corporate innovator. He's particularly proud of his role advising the government of Estonia, the United Nations Centre for AI and Robotics at The Hague, and Canadian Blood Services. Keith's role as the lead AI strategy advisor to the CIO of Estonia was profiled in the Wall Street Journal in November 2018. Thank you for joining us, Keith. It's great to see you.
Hi, great to see you. I hope you can hear me okay. And it's great to see you, friends. Talal, nice to see you as well. Thank you for those kind comments. It just seeing you on the screen just reminds me what a small world we have here, and or maybe I don't get out enough. I need to make some more make new connections, but I don't think that's true. I just think I keep running into amazing people. So, and Daniel, thank you as well for inviting NVIDIA to participate. I was thinking about this a little bit earlier as I was getting ready to call that I think one thing that NVIDIA, well, so as Talal was suggesting, and Daniel as well, one thing that the UAE and Australia have in common, many things, I think, and one of the lesser known things is their relationship with NVIDIA. We're quite proud of that. Obviously, the relationship was separate, but maybe now there's an opportunity to create more of a magic triangle sort of between us, and that's actually quite exciting. But one of the one of the other things I was thinking is that I think both the UAE and Australia, in terms of the size of your economy and the size of your population, probably often underestimated, in terms of the potential and impact that you have on the world. And I think you both nations punch above their weight and have exceeded expectations, particularly in this new chapter around artificial intelligence, right? And let's not forget, it's very new, right? I mean, if you just go back 5 years ago, there wasn't a nation in the world that had a national AI strategy, mind you, a minister of AI, and that wasn't even really conceptually possible. And so this whole chapter in sort of modern sort of technology policy and economic policy is less than 5 years old. So it's pretty new. And yet the incredible pace of innovation and collaboration, actually, and those are both very interesting adjacent themes, is very important. NVIDIA's history, NVIDIA has this kind of common theme with Australia and the UAE because, frankly, NVIDIA is one of the world's most valuable companies, but it's not one of the world's biggest companies. We are 50 times smaller than Amazon, for example, 50 times. We're at least 15 or 20 times smaller than Microsoft in terms of just the sheer number of employees, right? Number of offices. We have about 22,000 employees, which in the span of things is just not very much. You mentioned EY. I used to be a partner at Deloitte and EY. I mean, each of those firms are high quality firms, and they have in excess of 300,000 employees, so 10 to 15 times more than NVIDIA. So our impact on the world, our value in the marketplace is not tied to the size of our company. It's tied to the velocity and scale of the innovation that we create. And I think the same thing is true of Australia and the UAE. I think that is actually a very common trait. And when it comes to artificial intelligence, which is not one thing, right? AI is a constellation of technologies. It's a suite of capabilities. It includes both human and compute ecosystems, right? There's a lot going on there. But again, the UAE and Australia have both been very ambitious and really very thoughtful in how they've gone about building those things. As Talal mentioned, Group 42 is this incredible company that most people haven't heard of, and yet I will say with unscientific evidence, but just based on my expert opinion, that there's probably Group 42 probably has a more advanced infrastructure and a larger sort of human, data science team. I mean, all in, its overall raw AI capacity probably exceeds the vast majority of Fortune 500 companies in the world, hands down. And as I'm sure, the truth is most people have never heard of them, and yet they are a powerhouse, right? And not just because they have really awesome NVIDIA technology in their data center. That's a part of it, but that's not the only reason. So I think we're at this interesting time, to see all that. And one of the things that I focus on, and it's part of my job, but it's also more of a passion, is really the I'll say the democratization of AI, but that sounds a little. It feels a little overused. So I want to actually be very specific. It's really about the inclusivity of AI on a global scale across nations. I mean, what most people don't fully appreciate is that there are only of the 193 nations in the UN, only 31 have a top 500 supercomputer. That is one of the top 500 biggest computers in the world. For most of the last 30 years, that didn't really matter. I mean, those computers had very specific and narrow purposes, used for scientific computing and high performance sort of simulations related to some very narrowly scoped fields. And not having one was not really critical to your economy, to your future, to your prosperity, to your national security per se. That's no longer true. Right, the stack of technology that drives science, the stack of technology behind supercomputing and the capabilities the infrastructure and the expertise. That same stack of capability is now one of the engines for economic growth. It's one of the turning points for both prosperity and security, and it's actually quite important. And the fact that 160 nations in the world do not have one actually speaks to the growing disparity between the global north and the global south, between other things. And I know that the UAE and Group 42 directly have been involved in some of those issues, and frankly helping address that in Africa, for example, and also played a key role in using its technology during the COVID crisis, and I helped bring a lot of benefit to people who weren't immediately in their domain. But in the next 10 years, Australia in the Asia Pacific region and Group 42 and UAE in this region will actually have an opportunity to play an even greater role, as that divide, that compute divide, will actually lead to and throttle the economic progress of nations that do not have either that capability. It's going to play a bigger and bigger role. I recently joined President Biden's National AI Advisory Committee, and this was a major topic of the inclusivity of AI and access to not just the computing, but to the knowledge, to the education, to the benefits, to the shared sort of distribution of value from that technology. That's not going to happen by itself. So, and one of the 5 working groups of that committee is actually international cooperation, and I serve it. And that's because it's so important for nations to get together, for nations with shared values, a shared vision, to collaborate. And so I recognize and I praise the government of UAE and Australia for creating this bond between you and for collaborating, and of course for the privilege for NVIDIA to collaborate and be a part of that in our own way, and very excited for that. Sure. So thank you again for inviting me here today. Talal, it was wonderful to see you, and I will hand it back to you.
Thank you, Keith, and we look forward to hearing more from you. Look, this is obviously a very vast and complex topic with many areas of consideration that have been touched on in your opening remarks. I think just picking up on the thing that you just touched on, Keith, in terms of the Fortune 500 companies and the obvious complement to G42, and which is unsurprising that it's really harnessed and grasped AI so much, given the UAE has had such a focus and made this area a priority of strategic interest. But looking at private companies and the corporate perspective, what is, I guess, the greatest barriers to AI adoption from private companies? And combining this question with a question that's actually come in from Jack Dehennon from GC Advisory, what abilities need to be put in place, what critical abilities need to be put in place for an organization to fully harness AI in the private and corporate space?
Yeah, that's a really big question, hard to answer quickly. But here's the thing. I think one of the mistakes that I've observed over the last few years is that people think about AI like it's IT, and this is a big challenge. I think the first capability you need is to recognize that artificial intelligence is not the same as information technology. It is technology, and it involves technology, but actually AI is different. AI is not implemented as much as it's applied, right? There's a strong iterative scientific component to it. I mean, that is changing. I mean, there are parts of the AI spectrum that are becoming more industrialized and a little stronger. And you can consume versions of AI through third parties that are essentially like tools you would implement. But true competitive advantage comes from applying AI to solve really complex problems, and that is not easily done. That requires a level of patience and acceptance of failure, and also, as well as understanding of the risks and limitations of AI, which is very important, so that you build in the governance and the safeguards on the front and the back end. And those are just not capabilities that most organizations have right now. I mean, the same IT department, the same CIO, the same data center, all those things. And I'll give you just a really, I won't name the company respectfully, but just, a recent example where a very large company purchased a very small computer for us and just a couple of servers, frankly. So nothing like what G42 has. But this is a very large company, $30 billion company, and they had to ship these servers to their data center, and they got this very panicky call from the data center, the person that runs the data center, and he's like, "What do you want me to do with these?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" He says, "We have, we're like a Toyota dealer, and you just drop Lamborghini, on our backyard. We have no idea what to do with a Lamborghini, I mean, and that's because most people just think technology is technology, but that's not true. When you move into this world of very high-end, high-performance computing, and you are dealing with a level of hardware sophistication, software sophistication, the network infrastructure, the entire operation end-to-end is completely unfamiliar to 99.9% of those that work in data centers, IT departments. It's a completely adjacent world. It may look the same, but it's not. And it requires a completely different kinds of expertise. And so you just have, I think the most important skill is to understand that. Just understand that you're moving into a new phase. This coexists and sits on top of traditional computing. It's right. It obviously has things similar in common, but it is a new direction. And there's a high failure rate. I mean, there's a very high failure rate for those that do not acknowledge the distinction. And again, as I mentioned earlier, the risks, the governance needs. So all in, I think the number one skill is the leadership to sort of humility to acknowledge you're going in the right direction, you're going in a different direction, and to give the support and the sponsorship to those in that effort, including your partners, external vendors, to understand this is not like implementing an ERP system. This is a completely new chapter. So I would just sort of end on that note. Daniel's shaking his head, so we're in agreement.
Daniel, did you have anything to add to that?
Oh, look, I couldn't agree more with what Keith had to say. I think probably the other thing that we see on a really practical, from a really practical perspective is the need to get your data in order and understand your data and understand sort of traditional data management and real sort of basics. It really exposes the fact that if you don't have your data in order, it's very difficult to lead an organization and to leverage that data in different ways if you don't have the fundamentals of data management right. I think that's another sort of, when you talk about sort of those foundational capabilities that need to be in place, in addition to what Keith mentioned, that just the fundamentals of good management of data is a key enabling capability that organizations need to start to embrace if they're to get on board the wagon.
Yeah, and Talal, did you have anything to add to that?
Well, I think it was well covered by both Keith and Daniel. I mean, if I was to say one other thing is, it's important for people to actually, rather than just listen and hear the buzzwords AI and everything else, and it's important to see the magic that is AI or what it produces. And once they see that, call it whatever you want. But when you were a kid and you saw a magic trick and you thought it was actually really magic, you don't necessarily need to know what's happening behind the scenes, but that data-driven decision-making that predictive analytics with high compute can provide in certain domains are relevant to the person that is on the fence and maybe hesitant to embrace AI, thinking it's a lot more than it really is. I think that is a very powerful thing. And I'm wowed by it on a daily basis by some of the stuff our team puts together in enterprise solutions with big data, as Daniel mentioned. And like having the Rolls Royce in your data center versus the Honda in your data center, these are, you can use those as data points and say, yes, we have the best and we have it. But at the end of the day, it's all about the solutions that we're trying to drive towards. So when I mentioned computer vision-based borehole analysis, you show them the bottom line in terms of numbers and the decisions and the lessened amount of geologists that you would have need to solve something that would have otherwise taken weeks in 2 hours because of the compute. And that's like, brute force compute happening in the background, going through multiple images and then coming out with something with, either change detection. But then you have predictive analytics in terms of what may happen based on data ingestion. And that is really like magic. And I think the more people that actually see this, the more they will appreciate, number one, that it's achievable and they can apply it to some of the pain points that they may have. And number two, the more they'll understand it and not fear it per se, because of sometimes the dystopic view that people in Hollywood kind of attach to AI in many cases. I'm not saying it shouldn't be something we look at. I think with the narrow intelligence we have today, now super intelligence on a narrow basis, we don't have much to fear. But once it's more generalized, then there will need to be ethical considerations in place for how you regulate that on a government level, either in a single country or multilaterally even.
Absolutely, and we'll touch on that in a little while. In terms of, so I hear you. If you've got your data organized as a corporate, as a Fortune 500 company, that's a good place to start. It's understandable that a lot of corporates that operate outside of the research and development sphere don't have the risk appetite. They don't have the investor sort of bandwidth to fail. And they certainly don't have governance bandwidths to fail in sort of exploring these areas. And I don't know if there is an answer to this question, but what sectors or areas within the private space do you see have developed AI capabilities that are corporate in sort of either the health space or the financial services space or the defense space or in mining, for example, can and should be aware of at this point that has been de-risked to a level where they could start exploring it as a company?
Do you want me to respond?
Go for it.
So it's interesting. So we signed a partnership recently, a few months ago, with Australia's National Science and Research Agency, CSIRO, and I remember in working on that agreement before we put it together, one of the key parts was to identify sort of the areas of focus, and we had a lot of trouble picking, narrowing the areas of focus because there was so much opportunity, and every time we would shorten the list, someone would add something back on. And this kind of goes to your question, which is, AI is this pervasive general purpose technology that is reshaping every industry, right? And so it was hard to pick. I mean, certainly you mentioned mining. Certainly there are specific industries, obviously, in Australia that have actually been out in front of this topic. I mean, the mining sector in Australia has really been one of the leading developers and implementers, early adopters of autonomous systems. The largest robot in the world is a train in Australia, right? I believe, and of those mines are completely autonomous at this point. Like at South 32 and others, were hundreds of miles away. They're monitoring a mine that's basically run by robots, and so this has become that. So absolutely. Now across the world, you won't see that as much. But there isn't a sector of the Australian economy or that isn't affected. And the UAE, what was really fascinating about the UAE from the beginning, because of the strategy was so comprehensive that every agency in the government, from the roads authority to everybody, had to have a really well-developed AI strategy, and that was just a requirement, and that had to be tied to national benchmarks and other things. So it was really quite it was quite aggressive, and so again, I think that it's hard to pick an industry that is not affected. Some industries are out front, clearly, than others, and I think it tends to be the tech sector first, kind of led the industry, and then from the tech sector, it's kind of come down to these other industries. I would say healthcare is not a leading industry; it's just one of the more important industries by all means. It's one of the best examples of where AI is going to create a lot of value for the world, but it's not ahead by any stretch. There's still a lot of work to be done. I think the industrial sectors, manufacturing, cars, auto, that field, I think they're very aggressive adopters. But as you mentioned, financial services is huge. I mean, particularly in fraud detection and customer service. There's a significant adoption of AI and automation in general in that sector. So you can't really pick one. It's hard to say who's out ahead. But certainly within certain countries like mining in Australia, you will see leaders in those fields. So let me hand it back to the other panelists.
So I might jump in there if you don't mind. We've just got some thoughts.
Yeah.
Well, look, I agree 100%, Keith. I think it's not necessarily about the sector, but almost like the use case, if you like, within the sector and the transportability of that use case across different sectors. And so, as I mentioned at the beginning, I think something like object detection, as an example, can be utilised. The primary use case that we see in Australia is around law enforcement and national security. However, that same application of that use case can be applied to facilities management, service delivery, various different other contexts, with a really, really positive return on investment. So where I think that one of the benefits of bringing a group like this together for a discussion and obviously to further this work is to really draw out those stories and create the art of what's possible that is applicable across different sectors, but with tangible metrics that start to demystify that journey of getting to an AI-enabled world. I think people, to your point, Keith, around ERPs, I think every person who's done an IT project has got some sort of scars from a failed IT delivery project that's taken 3 years and returned half of its benefits that it had promised. And I think the introduction of AI is completely different, but people put it in the same sort of category. I think we can incrementally deliver value with AI, and we can start small and grow with very little investment. And we need to demystify that sort of approach to the introduction of these technologies to help people embrace and sort of start to play a little bit more with the art of what's possible. And I think at the moment, everyone's still in that stage where they still think the AI is that movie from Hollywood and it's going to change the world and somehow take away your control and your ownership of your own being.
Yeah. Just while we're on you, Daniel, if I may just interject for a second, you mentioned one of the 4 themes in your opening remarks currently as being the delivery of digital twins. You did refer to one example, but I just wondered if you could elaborate a bit more on what is a digital twin and give some more practical examples of how that might apply in maybe some other sectors as well.
Certainly. Yeah, look, the case, I'll be quite specific with this case. So we have an emerging, green energy storage company that's got quite an innovative value proposition of reusing abandoned mine shafts and turning them into energy storage and distribution. And so what we're doing is working with this company on the establishment of a digital twin, which is a digital representation of the physical, physical environment. And so that's really the use of that is it's done through modelling, through geographically accurate modelling, and also through sensors, through video, and through feedback mechanisms that allow you to create almost a digital model of that physical world. And so what we're doing that for, the value proposition for that organisation is to really look at optimising their operations, reducing downtime, preventative maintenance, but also about optimising the system as a whole and its interaction with the energy grid. So looking at global optimisation of assets and using analytical models to drive when you do and don't release power into the networks. And so, another, I think you might have mentioned it, Ellie, at the beginning, or maybe it was before the webinar started, the concept of autonomous vehicles having their own virtual world to run their training in, to train the model that will work in a physical world, negates the need to simulate tests in a physical world. And so that's sort of the concept of moving trial and error into a virtual world to do predictive work that actually can optimize the way you deliver things is a real exciting part of the use of AI. So we see that, that's one use case that we're working through. We see it being used in facilities management. So traditional ways, a very simple example is you might have a contract for somebody to mow the lawns out the front of the building or to cut the hedges. And maybe that contract happens once a month. But why don't we cut the lawns when the lawns need to be cut? So such a simple example of how you could use intelligence and through a representation of real world to drive intelligent decisions around optimizing a system.
Fantastic. Thanks, Daniel. Talal, from the Mohammed bin Zayed University of Artificial Intelligence to the UAE Ministry of Artificial Intelligence, the UAE is obviously investing heavily in this space. Not many countries have ministers for artificial intelligence, but the UAE does. What opportunities do you see for the Australia and Emirati businesses to collaborate on looking forward and with the things that you're learning as an organization, but also that you're aware of from the country perspective?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there are quite a bit. I don't know if I was to pinpoint one, I would look at how do we leverage one another's strengths in different domains, be it industries and applications, and then try to figure out how a company like ours or similar companies to us can partner with Australian companies, be it here in the UAE or in Australia, to unlock the full potential of those use cases. But like you said, I think the environment that the UAE government has created that allows us to operate and as Keith put it, punch above our weight is really something we're blessed with. And it is a testament to the vision of the leadership in really helping move the needle on AI, not just locally, but on a global level. And so from my perspective, I think what I've seen in Australia, again, similar industries in energy, the mining one specifically, is something that's quite conducive to having autonomous operations and robotics, which obviously the underlying technology thereof would be artificial intelligence to kind of help enhance those mechanisms. I think there are ways that we would be able to build on what Australia has done very well in those areas and then apply them to use cases over here that are quite unique to our environment. And again, to the point Daniel made about transferability, that's the type of thing that we look for. In fact, I remember when I was in the space industry, the one thing that I was extremely excited about in tying up was how do we figure out how to take what Australia has built in the mining industry with autonomous operations and robotics to space even, and do that on the moon or on Mars. So there are so many different things that we could look at collaborating on, but I think the lowest of hanging fruits would be in the healthcare space, the energy space, or whatever it might be, looking at the common denominator in some of those technologies, the AI-based technologies, the ones Daniel mentioned, computer vision, NLP, and in our case, we have a much more advanced Arabic language model than other countries in the world. So you could look at applying what you've learned and applied NLP to in Australia to the Arabic world that has 400 million Arabic speakers. So it's not just UAE centric, but from the UAE serve that using and leveraging the infrastructure we have and the support we have from a common partner like NVIDIA, and finding those synergies that we could then unlock value together with.
Great, thanks, Talal. Now we have two questions. Christopher Pine, I think, would like to ask a question. So, sir, would you like to go ahead?
Thanks, Ellie, and thank you very much for moderating this webinar event this afternoon. And thank you to Daniel and Keith and Talal for joining us. It's a very important subject. It's very much an insiders-outsiders subject, and listening to the conversation, that only reinforces that point, that people inside the tent know what everyone's talking about, and people outside the tent feel completely divorced from it. And for me, as a former politician and minister, the one of the biggest challenges, I think, to AI and its take-up is the ignorance of legislators, regulators, and ministers about what AI is all about and its uses and its impact on the economy, especially over the long term, which is obviously going to be immense. So does the industry have any kind of strategy that they that they are collaborating on or thinking about to take the debate about AI, its uses and its ethics to regulators and legislators who could actually be the biggest problem in AI reaching its full potential?
Yeah, Chris, I feel like you know my pain. And so I feel like you really got right in there. A couple of things on that topic. So that's a really great question. First off, yeah. So with all due respect, AI is a complicated topic, right? And so I think it's not that hard to understand why a lot of people don't understand it, and to some extent there's also a lot of this misinformation. But as I go around the world, and I have the privilege of being sort of the primary interface to foreign governments, so I have meetings and conversations every single week with governments across the world, and so I have a pretty healthy view on this topic. For the most part, 99% of those that I meet do not understand what AI is, or worse, they have the wrong understanding, and dangerously wrong. But also, even going below that, they may understand. There's kind of these three pillars to AI. There's sort of data, there's the algorithms, and those that create the algorithms, the data scientists, and then there's the infrastructure, the computing, and to some degree, I would say there's a fair amount there's some understanding. It's not always correct, but there's some understanding, and there's a lot of policy focus on data and the issues related to data. And there's some focus and policies around algorithms. There's far less understanding on the infrastructure side. And it's actually such a blind spot globally that the OECD has set up a dedicated task force called the AI Compute and Climate Task Force, whose primary mission is to develop a easy to understand, non-technical framework for helping government leaders sort of get hands around how much AI capacity do they have, and is it enough for their country? And I'm the co-chair of that task force, and Angus McCustra from CSIRO is also on the task force. And so this is a widespread problem, worldwide. And as you said, sometimes the problem, but it is what it is. I mean, so I think part of the obligation from an industry perspective is to have these conversations, right? To engage and to educate. So it's not so much to sell or to market, but to educate. And I know I spend a considerable amount of my time doing just that. I know other big tech firms also do that as well, and have a lot of engagement on these topics. But it is a blind spot, and it does lead to calculations from a policy perspective. And I would say, because you mentioned economics and you mentioned ethics, and what I would say is actually, if there is a bright spot, I would say there's certainly a lot more focused and understanding on the potential risks today than ever before on AI. And there's a lot of both domestic and international bodies, focused on that topic and so forth, and shared principles, right? From the OECD, shared principles on that topic, and the EU's leadership around trustworthy AI and so forth. So I feel like there is progress there. What I think is coming up behind it, and maybe a little bit earlier, is just the understanding that artificial intelligence is going to be one of the key drivers of economic growth, and across all industries, and that failure to invest in the skills, the human component, as well as the infrastructure and the ecosystems, will directly affect prosperity over time, and the opportunity for countries to participate in what you can think of as sort of the dividend from AI, which all the firms have a number, PwC, McKinsey, everyone's come up with a number, but let's just, it's in excess of somewhere in the 10 to 15 trillion, range, but, that won't be evenly distributed, right? Not every country will get that, will get its equal share. You have to go after it. And I think that is definitely where, more education has to be sort of focused on. So anyway, I think it's a great point. Everyone struggles with that issue, but there are some bright spots, but I know that I'm doing my part, and I'm sure others are as well.
Yeah, I mean,
hello, Daniel.
Yeah, I agree with you, Keith. Daniel, if I may, one thing I would mention, sometimes we look at ethical AI and ethics in AI in a very one-dimensional fashion, and we see it from, again, trying to demystify it to help people avoid thinking of AI as something that could be that could lead to a dystopic future and the Terminator scenario and all these other crazy things. But I think the immediate need that we're seeing more, and I think Keith, you touched on it in terms of data privacy and what Europe has done, is ensuring that while we are creating the infrastructure of enablement for AI, which in our case, or I think even in Daniel's case, we are building, we're more like the utility. And then there is not really a regulator in place in many different countries or on a multilateral level to show you what the right approach to using AI would be, or what would be ethical and what would not. And it's very hard to come to a common denominator on anything these days, even at the UN. So, AI is actually going to be a lot more subjective. But when you think of data privacy, that is an important thing, and that is something that we could immediately address. And while we enable technological digital transformation with the compute and with the muscle power that many companies can bring to the table, or with the brain power on the analytics side, what we need to do is also enable digital sovereignty. I think that is going to be something that's increasingly important across the world, especially for countries that are leapfrogging the traditional way of building the capability to get to that point. So, a country in Africa would be a recipient of technologies from multiple different countries. Not every one of them have the same shared set of values, right? And so their influence will be a product of the technology provider. What we have done successfully in the UAE, and it's not like we strove out to do that, what we did was a consequence of a demand and of an economic forcing function that the government had. We need to build and own and operate our own digitally sovereign cloud in the UAE. And based on that model that we kind of stumbled upon 5 years ago, we now have first movers advantage in an area where other big cloud providers are trying to play. And so what we have in that model that's been successful in the UAE, where you're looking to emulate in other countries on a smaller scale, so that they can get a taste of digital transformation without feeling the hesitation or worry that there would be privacy issues, or that their clouds and their digital infrastructure would be subject to foreign jurisdictions, or the potential of there to be an off switch to that system. And so I think to a point Keith made earlier about democratizing, I think rather than it be looked at as only democratizing AI, it's one where you're giving every country and every entity that is a recipient of this technology the ability to independently operate it in a way that allows for as much digital sovereignty as possible.
That's a great point.
Ellie, I might just add one last point to that one, if I can quickly. I think through this whole conversation, we've all seen the enormity of the problem that we've got in front of us. But I can't help but think that what we've all got to do is just take one step forward. And everyone takes one step forward, we will eventually get there. And I think, when we think about general AI and sort of rather than the narrow use cases, you can almost get lost in the forest without seeing the trees. And so I know that at xAmplify, we try and simplify, we try and take one step. Some of our enabling capabilities, which is similar to what G42 have got around a sovereign high performance compute based on NVIDIA, really bring down the barriers to entry that allows somebody to take that first step, understand, grow, solve some of these issues and move forward. Because if you almost step back and try and solve all these issues before you move forward, I think we'll never get anywhere. So just wanted to add that last piece in.
Fabulous, thank you. So just one last question that I had for us to wrap up, really, and it ideally is a big question, but if you could keep it brief, that would be good. So the year is 2035, and what is one thing that we have and or are experiencing that we aren't today, that you predict or expect us to have in our world then?
Can I jump in with a one-liner?
Yeah.
That is a community that is embracing innovation using AI.
I would say we're experiencing less gravity because we're on Mars by then.
How do you compare? How do you beat Mars? Oh boy, that's really. Look, you mentioned digital twins. What I would just earlier, I would just circle back to that and say, actually, I believe that the ability to simulate not just a metaverse, but millions upon millions of virtual worlds for different purposes will become a strategic capability for nations and for companies. And to a large extent, the ability to simulate a virtual world becomes a tool almost for time travel, and the ability to both look in the past and predict the future for anything, whether it's for business or policy purposes. And I think this will be a fundamental change in how we approach things.
Fantastic.
The question becomes, do the people in the simulation know that they're in a simulation?
That's a whole other issue. That's a whole other
We're going to need a
workshop.
whole other webinar and topic
Yeah.
for that, I think. Great. So we've got greater understanding, the embracing of this and collaboration. We're on Mars, some of us, and if we're not on Mars, we're in one of several metaverses, simulating life with the hope of actually doing it in real life. Fantastic. Thank you so much, gentlemen. What a stimulating conversation, and I think that Christopher made a very, very good point in that it is an insiders outsiders topic. And thank you very much for explaining just a small part of this to us generalists or our outsiders today, and for expanding a little bit for those insiders who have joined us. Just a reminder to everybody on the webinar, if you'd like to be involved in the working group that the council is launching today, please reach out to Tamika, and she'll add you to that working group. And if no one else has any further comments, I'd just like to say thank you. A special thanks to our co-chairs, His Excellency Badr Al-Alama and the Honourable Christopher Pine, and a big thank you to the Aus UAE Business Council team, especially Tamika for putting this webinar together, and Kaissi as well for supporting on this topic. We look forward to seeing what the working group comes up with and discussing this further in the future.
A big thank you to you as well.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ellie.
Okay.
Thanks all.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.